Hi, and welcome to Decoding AQ, helping you to learn the tools, mindsets, and actions to thrive in an ever-changing world.
Hi, and welcome to the next episode of Decoding AQ. With me today, I have Chris Deaver. Welcome.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So Chris joins us. He's the co-founder of BraveCore. He describes himself as a coach, a speaker, and a cultural supercharger. So we're going to learn a bit more about what that might mean in a moment. He's an ex-Apple guy, Disney, Dell, VMware. So he has done the rounds for the last couple of decades in some really interesting senior HR roles. And actually where I'd like to start, Chris, is I want to take you back maybe 20 years to your time at Leadership Excellence, where you were a development coach, but you were mentored, I understand, by the ghostwriter/editor of 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And as a fan of the book, and in fact, we bought 7 Habits of Highly Effective Teenagers for my wife's youngest son years ago. It had a massive impact. But I want to understand, was there a really big impact of that experience for those couple of years on you? And if so, what was it?
Oh, thanks. Yeah, thank you, Ross. That's a great quick question. And first, I'll just thank you for inviting me into this conversation. And yeah, I don't know that I've gone back that far for a while. So this is an interesting, dive, I guess, into my past. But yeah, I always had an affinity for that book, right? The 7 Habits. There's something that Covey, tapped into with those principles that was very deep, right? About who we are, right? As human beings and as people. And so I wanted to understand, that better. And so, so I worked with a guy, his name is Ken Shelton. He was ghostwriter, kind of the first editor, did the first pass on the 7 Habits and really got it to a kind of a healthy place for the publisher. And I was just staying curious. I was interested in the principles. I was interested in how leadership worked. And I got to be essentially kind of the ghost of the ghost. So I was helping Ken in the editing process, with this magazine that, Covey had been part of, and Ken Blanchard, years before that. And I got to basically take the edits that Ken was doing and plug them into the computer and do graphic design and kind of pull all this stuff together, right? And in the process, I got to see, how you kind of shape these principles and how these things worked. And so, that was just a great accelerator for me, right? Learning. And then of course I got more interested in wanting to actually meet, Stephen Covey and learn from him, which I later had the opportunity to do. And he became a mentor of mine personally. So that was really special. But, just that process of seeing and understanding, how these kinds of the principles that we know as truth, that are kind of the deeper wisdom, even ancient wisdom, can apply to, simple, everyday, practical life, experiences that we have and work. So that was fascinating for me.
And I think it's these things, a lot of these fundamental principles of how do we function as humans? How do we function as society? How do we function in environments of work? A lot of the things actually are very stable, very similar. All of the principles are there, but often the environment and the context shifts. It shifts on a local, global scale in various different ways. And so from jumping in at that stage where you're around these amazing thinkers distilling their information, to then go into a role, and I believe you went into Dell after there in a HR role, and then this journey around people, around organization design, and then hitting at this point now where you describe yourself as a cultural supercharger. Just give me an overview. What does that actually mean? What is a cultural supercharger, and how did that evolve in these various roles that you've had in these monster organizations?
Yeah, well, and when I was, I guess rewinding the tape again at that time, and just interested in leadership and culture and principles, I wanted at first to just dive into, a company like that and just be consulting, right? And for me, you know, everybody's experience is different, right? And actually, I literally had, you know, in working with, you know, Stephen, I created a nonprofit mentoring network, and you know, he was part of that, kind of our board, you could say, and I worked with a little bit with his son, Sean Covey, and was invited in to work there, you know, Franklin Covey. And I had this existential moment where I realized this is amazing. These are all the right things, but it is not my place in the world. I have to do something else. And what I realized was, for me, it was important to just experience inside and out, right, a company culture. And so I went back, got my MBA. You know, and I'm one of these people. So I studied animation for my undergrad years before. And so that was, you know, kind of a weird thing. I did a minor in business. So I'd be in, you know, art classes thinking about business, and I'd be in business classes thinking about art. So I was a total misfit. And so, you know, similarly with, you know, when I was right in the thick of, you know, thinking about what's next for me, well, I did my MBA, and I realized I've got to get in the trenches, you know, with these companies and learn these cultures. And that was the experience, you know, that was, I'd say, introductory. It was kind of perfect because here's a company, Dell, that, you know, had a lot of success. You know, Michael Dell had, you know, created, you know, he was actually, I think, one of the youngest, you know, kind of multi-billionaires at the time. He'd been very successful, but he had come back in the reins of CEO. He's trying to turn the company around. The PC business was deteriorating. So it was essentially a cultural fixer-upper. And so I came in, and, you know, it was a blank sheet. Hey, what do you want to do here? Right. And the first natural fit was, hey, you've done global mentoring, you know, organizations before, you know, do you want to help us launch our first, you know, global mentoring network? So I helped do that. And then I just got really ambitious and a little crazy. And I was working with some friends, you know, cross-functionally. We all had, you know, kind of, I'd say, venting sessions where we'd sit and just be, you know, frustrated with the culture. You know, why are we so P&L conscious? Like, we'd sit in meetings staring at spreadsheets, right? And I thought, there's no way we're going to spreadsheet our way into the future, right? We're not going to find innovation by staring at these numbers. I mean, granted, there's a time and a place, right? But when it was excessive, it just made it really difficult to see this future that, you know, Michael Dell was talking about. And so, you know, with some friends there, I got a little, you know, say inspired, but I wrote a white paper. It's 33 pages, and it covered all of the cultural problems with Dell, and also where the hope of the future was. And then I outlined essentially a few core elements that could help them become their future self as a culture. And, you know, this is a company, again, that had rode the waves of success, right? They had what was called the direct model of, you know, so you could get online and purchase your computer, you get all the components, and it changed the game. But the other companies had caught up, right? HP, all these other companies. Now, what we found was, in studying the business model, it had overlapped with the cultural model, where leaders had adopted this direct model approach to their behavior. And now, when you unpack the dark side of that, that was, you know, the dark side was, the good side was, hey, execution, right? They're driving towards the objective. They're getting things done fast. The dark side of it was, they'd show up and it was very inhuman. It was, hey, I just have the answers. They adopted this Bain approach of answer first at the time. And, you know, they were very focused on, hey, I have the answers as a leader. And that's not conducive to innovation. It's not conducive to empowerment. And so those were the things that were really highlighted for the future, you know, in this white paper and in this cultural conversation we were starting was, well, the future isn't the direct model. We've optimized that. It's what we call the connect model. And, you know, to take an analogy, is essentially looking at, well, we built a Ford, right? Mustang goes 0 to 60, right? And whatever, 2 seconds, but we got to build a Shelby, right? Aero EV that can get us to 250. Michael wanted to get to $100 or $200 billion organization. They're about 50 billion at the time. We said the only way to do that is through culture, right? You've got to change this leadership mindset to listen first, right? To empower innovation. And So I sent that paper to Michael. We had this team, we were rolling, and we had a business model attached to it, but mainly it was about this leadership cultural model. And so we sent it to him. I sent an email to him. Of course, I ended up in later in a meeting with my boss, my manager, and she's like, so she says to me, what was this email to Michael? And I said, well, we were in an all hands meeting and he said, hey, if you have ideas, we're trying to transform the company, send it to me. And so I said, I took him up on it. She said, well, they say that, right? But they don't really mean that. I said, well, we're a company of integrity, right? Like that's a principle of ours. So he said it. And she said, well, Bob is aware. And Bob was this like SVP of HR, and he's from GE and he's a smart guy, but he was kind of this like Steven Seagal type where he could just walk in a room, he could like chop the table in half with his mind, and I'm thinking, oh boy, so this could be a very career limiting move. So that was what I heard. This is, Bob's aware that okay. Fast forward a day or two, and Michael responds at about 5 a.m., in the morning one day, to this. Presumably he's read the whole thing. He says, huge respect for this initiative, Chris. I love it. Right. What's next? I had no idea what was next. I hadn't planned beyond just presenting that, right, and get us to that space. Now, I did end up in meetings with him where we asked for, $5 million in budget for this tool that Salesforce offered to connect teams, across the company, this kind of social tool. We did a think tank accelerator called Game Changers, where it was essentially like a Shark Tank type experience. Michael got involved, and we had actually $billion apps that emerged from that. But it came from the people, right? People that had ideas that were latent, that they hadn't been asked, right? And we put them into teams, and they started forming these things. So that was part of the initiative, and that was just kind of one of the experiences I had, and I realized in that work at Dell, and of course, then meeting with Michael, and then I started meeting with the C-level folks, and consulting and sharing this work, and that same manager that was testing me, right? And by the way, Bob too, the SVP, and this is where like I, I'm a very non-traditional HR person, and it's gotten me almost into trouble on many occasions. But, again, this was one of those times where I just felt like if I'm not here to disrupt or do things that are good for the sake of the company in the future, then what is my point, right? And what is my point on earth? So I did that work, and then Bob and my manager both supported this one president. He was president over all consumer. His name's Stephen Felice. And, I sent the paper to him, the same white paper. He read it, and he said he had a similar response as all of the folks were having, which was, this is amazing, right? We need to live these principles. So he goes into a meeting and he presents, and, Bob and my leader come out of it, and they're like, we've never seen him like that. Like, he is on fire, right? With people about what leadership really is, the future culture of the company. We've never heard him talk like that. Now, I didn't tell them like, hey, it was my, and I can't take all the credit either, but I ended up in a room sitting with Bob, that SVP of HR, and he says to me, and he is pissed, right? He's like, Chris, you're like that Facebook guy, right? And this was back when that movie came out, Social Network, right? And I said, well, Bob, thanks. I mean, I take that as a compliment. Like, the guy created a pretty amazing platform, right? He goes, no, you don't understand. He said, if he was here, I'd fire him in 2 weeks. I was like, oh, okay. I get what you're trying to say. But, the interesting thing was he couldn't fire me, because here I was influencing Michael and these C-levels. And, we started to build other programs around the work. He actually ended up leaving, Bob did, but, I have a lot of respect for him overall. It was just a funny moment, but it was one of those things that then when Disney reached out, they were in the thick of moving more digital. Bob Iger had, other Bob, had set the tone for, investing in the future. And, they reached out to me, and that was, a dream, right? To work. I literally had a dream list. But Dell wasn't on the dream list, but I just made a choice like, hey, this is a good place to cut my teeth. But Disney and Apple were both on that list. So when that happened, I leaned in. So, yeah.
And Chris, that opportunity of, many people may observe something and see it as working or not working, be able to spot, what could shift, what could change, and identify that, is then often very different to it getting buy-in, enabling it to happen, getting over the corporate immune system, whether that's an individual who, shuts the door, or just the culture isn't built to take on innovations that shift the future when it means letting go and saying goodbye to what has been. And I think that's a very interesting shift for many organizations. If we just rewind maybe 10 years, everyone was feeling very different about the pace of innovation. We were getting lots of disruptions coming in fintech. EdTech was certainly not a space where that was happening. People wasn't, we were looking at technology to solve efficiency and optimization, but then this human side of stuff, it might be what you identified, Chris, of the creator of. I remember working at projects with Unilever. They had a program called Pitch, and it sounds similar to the Dell, like Shark Tank type thing, where they had these actually massive physical places. You'd go in, you'd run a series of workshops, and everyone had to, by the end result, do their 3-minute pitch on whatever the new innovation, product, utilization, whatever it would be, to get backing, to get funding or whatever. So this driver of innovation from a cultural perspective had been happening, but this challenge to then go from that idea to actual execution of it is hard, isn't it? You get people leaving, you get, excitement, and then from excitement to hey, we've also got to do what we're already doing. We've got business as usual. We have all of these things that are in place that we're really efficient by, and you've come along and shaken stuff up. How did you deal with that? Did you just go, I just sprinkled the start, went over to Walt Disney, do the next bit, sprinkled the start, and is that where you really love in that initial energy piece or transition neck piece? Just give me your thoughts and observations of those phases and periods and where you really love, and then maybe wrap it up to perhaps then weaving into what is BraveCore and what does BraveCore really focus on in those phases or stages. It'd be great, Chris.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a great question, right? Because you highlighted the fact that, disruption it's definitely exponentially accelerated, right? I don't even hear the words change management anymore. And I'm glad. I don't really like those words, right? It was always like, hey, let's go on a rafting trip and let's just sit in the shallow end, right? Or just let's try to analyze everything that's happening and let's predict and have all this safe predictability. And you're not going to ever have that. You go on a rafting trip, you're going to get flipped, right? Somebody's going to fly out, and you just have to be agile to that, right? And I see leaders leaning into that, and that's exciting, right? Because the art of that is true. And it's essentially always been the case. I mean, I go back to my days in business school, and hundreds of business cases we would go through, right? And at the end of it, and you always kind of want that one answer. Well, what was the answer, right? And the professors would say, well, it depends, right? Well, what's your goal, right? I have a friend that says this to me about exercise goals. I say, well, what do I need to do? He's like a Tom Brady. He's just this really stocky guy, right? And I'm like, well, he's like, well, it depends on your goals, right? And I think for a lot of companies, it depends on their goals. But I will say this, the most exciting work for me really is shaping that best future culture. And the companies that will not only lead the future, but they'll be able to do it in a way that is exciting, right? And is a magnet for themselves and, for others. And, we could highlight examples of that. We've, I guess talked about a few, but I mean, Pixar, Nike, Apple, there's startups that are doing this. And my experience, with this kind of story arc, right? I guess if I were to step back and say, what is the most exciting element and most needed to begin something like this? It's a story, right? And it's a story that is powerful enough at the core, right, to change things and to change the culture. So if you take Steve Jobs, right, what he did with Think Different at Apple, he started with the story. Now it happened to tie to their core the core ingredients that were already true. So that's very important, right? And this could be said about a person, but this could also be said if you look at a culture as a person, its future self, right? One of my favorite movies is Interstellar, right? And Chris Nolan, he's just a master at this. But that moment where Matthew McConaughey's character, he's in the future, he's gone through the black hole, right? And he's pulling his present self into the future, essentially, right? And there's a sense about that with culture is, how do you do this? And how do cultures actually become their future selves at their best? And if you were to tell that story and have the intuition, or to intuit what that is and find and discover what that is, how would you go about it? So that was part of the work I looked at Dell, and I realized that was what I want to do. At Disney, it wasn't hard at Disney. A lot of those elements were coming together. It was becoming very clear, right? The Lucas acquisition, Marvel. I mean, Bob was doing a lot of that kind of work and bringing in people, through the acquisition of Pixar, and Steve helped maneuver that, right? Jobs, Ed Catmull, right? Who wrote Creativity Inc. Here's a guy that's, he's like just a Jedi level, right? Of creativity and culture. And his book, it distills down, it's very introspective, right? But it's the principles of what made essentially the future of Pixar's culture, right? The best future self. And we realized that was a template, or I realized that was a template for Disney, right? Those principles. So that's how I looked at it, was these are the principles of Disney's best future self. And since then, and I can get into this a little more, but with BraveCore, now we bring Ed into some sessions and have him share things. And then we would also do some of the brainstorming we talked about earlier, as far as ideation and people pulling ideas, and, best ideas win. Disney's a company that it's phenomenal. The culture is amazing. But there was a sense of bureaucracy, and, kind of layers, right, so to speak. But Ed's and, their approach at Pixar is very different than that. It's an open system. And so we were instilling that into Disney and being more transparent, right? Disney's a very nice culture, and that's fine, but you have to challenge each other, right? In ways that are also meaningful, and you can maintain or build strong relationships. In fact, they can get stronger. But we were teaching some of that too. So I found what Ed had done with that book was distill those principles down. So I found myself in a lot of sessions just really talking about Pixar principles and letting people loose on building ideas, workshopping, and creating new business, products and services. And then that led to, Pixar is a sister company with Apple. Steve's that kind of common connection. And I started writing about my experiences, and pretty soon, Apple came to me and said, hey, we have this challenge. 70% of our people are newer to the company, 5 years or less. And, we've hired a lot, and, we've been selective, but, we need help. We can't train managers fast enough, or these teams, to understand what it means to be Apple. And for those that know what that means, it's a really big deal, right? Like their culture is sacred to them. It's everything. And I had, coming into that system, or that culture, it was a lot of learning, right? I realized, wow, these people are at the top of their game. They hire the best of the best, right? They bring in PhDs, people that have written white papers about things, and they say, well, this can't be done, right? And then the engineers at Apple say, well, we're going to do it, right? Like AirPods, they said, you can't actually, the wireless systems, they don't exist for this. And I'm like, well, this is partly why we hired you. You're saying no, but you're going to help us build it, right? And it's just how they roll. But what I found was there was this friction happening in the system, right? Where Steve called it rock tumbling, right? Where debate can happen, and that's good. That can be fruitful. But when these organizations become so big, and Apple's the only company I'm aware of at the scale that it is, 100,000 some people, that is fully functional. So these leaders don't own a P&L. There's no general managers. They just are focused on innovating in their space. And that's great. But the challenge that was happening was, there was friction in the system, and there's also this premise of secrecy at Apple. Like my brother, he works in the government and armed forces, and he doesn't tell me anything. And I'd say, hey, you don't tell me anything. And he'd say, well, you tell me less, Apple is just that way. But it's about preserving the surprise and delight. When a product launches, most people that have worked on it, they don't even know, right? So they're in there like, wow, this is amazing. Now, internally, especially as you're bringing on those 70%, the people that are new, right? And by the way, generationally, folks that are used to collaborating and sharing information, they were saying, we don't know how to operate this way, right? And we were seeing friction and just a lot of challenges. And again, I thought, I got really introspective. I don't really know what to do here. I wrote a Fast Company article about this, about the AirPods experience. And, I looked at like Clayton Christensen. He wrote a book called The Innovator's Dilemma that Steve Jobs had referenced a lot. And we looked at, well, what is he saying? And in an interview, he said, well, they asked about Apple. He goes, I think about a lot of companies, I feel like a mom sometimes, I worry about them. He goes, and I worry about Apple. He said, but I think they're going to be okay if they can do this thing that Steve would do, which is when problems arose or as it relates to competition, even, he wouldn't look left or right. He was looking, directly in the mirror and essentially asking the question, what do I need to do differently? And he said, if you can keep doing that, if Apple could keep doing this, that will be powerful and that will help them. I realized, well, there was a secondary question to that, which was, what is the mirror now, right? Steve's gone. Tim's a very different leader. It's a diffused power model, right? Steve was more definitive about, hey, I've got a direction, right? He'd aggregate and then he'd focus it. Tim, almost the opposite, where he allows for a lot of space, right? He listens, he asks great questions, he sits back. But then you had leaders saying, well, when's the direction going to happen, right? When is this going to converge? I said, well, that's on you, right? Let's figure it out together. And so we looked for models that were working. And one of the ones that we found, that was a great one, actually, was in the camera team. And they were developing, they had what they called the brain trust, and Pixar does the brain trusts. This was the camera brain trust, the CBT. And we looked at the ingredients of this. How is this working? Why? And of course, this is the tech that is amazing, right? A lot of the stuff in, iPhones and other products that work so well. And so we just got really intentional about, well, if there's a mirror, let's say it's in shards, right? And if you compile this mirror into one, this future mirror of the future culture of Apple, what is it? And what are the first principles of this mirror? And so we got to know some of the best leaders from that team and other teams that were recommended to us. And they told us things that were counterintuitive to the culture, surprisingly, right? So where this premise of secrecy was such a big deal, they would say, well, it's about sharing, right? And, granted, they were saying, do it well, do it smart in a smart fashion, right? You're not blasting things out there, but, so you're being intentional, but share early. So there's a bit of counterculture to what they were actually doing, right? At the core, these leaders. And so again, I realized, well, we've got to have a story to this, right? It has to be a powerful enough story that it takes on a life of its own, right? It becomes viral inside this company. And by the way, this is a company too that doesn't have a high tolerance level for anything that doesn't look innovative, and especially coming from HR, right? So these leaders I would meet with, they're like, hey, whatever program you have in mind, I don't really care, because I got to get back to like creating amazing technology. Thank you very much. So it had to be something that would essentially overwhelm the system with how amazing it was and build on the past, right? This storied history of theirs. And so there's no way getting around the fact that Think Different is at the core of Apple, right? It is today just as much as it was back when Steve launched that, and he really didn't launch, he intuited something, right? He said this is at the core. And it's true that the variety of voices they have is fundamental to their innovation. People will be in a room and you could have a voice coming from any place, any experience level, and there's a humility to the universe where they embrace that. But the challenge that lied in our friction that we saw and in escalations that I was dealing with, and it was a lack of, say, collaboration. There wasn't enough connective tissue across horizontally. There's deep verticals as far as experience and those voices that were amplifying, but how it connected, it wasn't clear sometimes. Now, in some teams it was, right? So the camera team, but we said, well, how do we amplify this? So we met with people like Angela Ahrens, she was running retail, Greg Joswiak, who runs all of marketing. And it all distilled down in my mind and with this team, the realization that the next level was, it's not just Think Different, but it's different together, right? And how we work and how we partner, how we collaborate, how we co-create. And so that was essentially an inside out culture movement. And, ended up on the website, the diversity team we partnered with, and the idea was give leaders something that they can teach, right? That they can share. And they did, right? So we had leaders, that camera team leader, Graham Townsend, he got up on a stage, there's 250 leaders. We had a card, right, that had the 7 first principles of different together. And if you look at this holistically, now to back up, right, to zoom out, because I was, essentially trained in the Covey kind of system of thought, right? There's principles for our lives. But what we were saying was, well, what if you could custom essentially these set of principles for a culture, right? That's their future. And you could build that for them with them co-creatively. And we did that, right? And so, yeah, there's, some articles about it, the one I did in Fast Company, but that kind of cover it. And then with BraveCore, the next question became, well, if we zoom out further, we ask ourselves, are there meta principles, right, that can help anybody, any leader, any team, any culture to frame their principles, right, to design, to shape their principles? And what would those be, right? And that would be the most relevant to the future. And so we got really curious about that. And so my friend and I, so we're talking about this one day, we're like, well, Ed Catmull's the guru, right? He's the Jedi, and we've got to meet with this guy, right? We had him on some Disney conference calls, but I never met him in person. I was like, we got to meet this guy. And we happen to know some, and I was like, I don't know. So we just said this out loud, right? And I wasn't sure how it was going to happen. I happen to know a guy at Apple University, at Apple, who had worked with Ed. Randy Nelson, who was the founder of Pixar University. He's got a whole storied thing. He's an amazing guy, really amazing. And so he sends it. I said, hey, I'd love to connect with Ed. And he sends an email to Ed direct, and he copies me, and he says, Ed, fearless leader of Pixar, I'd like to introduce you to Chris, fearless leader at Apple. And I was very flattered by that. But, we end up in a meeting and a conversation with Ed. It's supposed to be 30 minutes. We're at the Lazy Dog restaurant in Cupertino. And, basically just to narrow it to what we learned, we asked him, at first I'm thinking, this guy is Yoda, right? I'm just going to click the wisdom button, the wisdom dispenser, and he's going to go. But no, he actually sits back and he just asks questions and he's listening. This goes on for 15 or 20 minutes, right? And at one point I'm looking at my business partner. I'm like, I'm just kind of nervous, right? Because I realized this isn't what I expected. And I just paused and said, Ed, what's your leadership philosophy? And he said, I lead with a question. And he told us about a meditation retreat that he did. His wife encouraged him to do 7 days, 2 to 3. The first 2 or 3 days, he said he was driving crazy. It was like, all you could do is ask questions and listen. But it changed him as a leader. And that, we realized, was one example, if we zoom out to the meta principles of BraveCore, that lead with a question. And that's actually the name of our podcast, Lead with a Question. And, it's this notion that that's leadership today, right? And then the future, that's how teams, are going to do their best work. I know with my kids, it's true on that level too, right? If I lead with a question versus an answer, it just works better. But definitely with teams too. Yeah.
What a flip from the times of Bain and Co. and, answer first, to question first,
Yeah.
And I want to pick up on a few elements, Chris, of that amazing arc of story of things, of trying to think in principles. I think the difference between meta principles as a framework that you can then apply to find your own principles for your organization, that is about identifying the roadmap to the future self. I don't know if you've come across Ben Hardy's work. Author, future self, personality isn't permanent, all of these sorts of things, and this notion of using imagination to create future rather than using data analytics. And everything before innovation was about how do I look at efficiency, productivity, all of these things to drive innovation, versus how do I explore, how do I imagine, how do I create?
Yeah.
So, a couple of thoughts. First one, have you seen General Magic, the documentary General Magic?
No.
You must check it out.
Okay.
Let me double check before the end of the episode that it is called General Magic. I'm pretty sure it is, but it's about Apple. And it's real footage of the time many years ago when they were trying to do lots of innovation and creating some interesting things. And the people in it, these young people, have gone on to be the greats that we now know, but it was their early careers, and it was a huge, for want of a better word, flop, crash, failure in one sense. But it was the biggest kind of cross innovation between communications company, AT&T, Apple, between a few different people, massive thing. And it was all surrounded in secrecy. And so that came in my head when there was this closed, we need the surprise and delight versus co-creation, open sourced, imagination, and when is the right time of that. So I like your concept of strategic open source, collaboration at the right time, early, but in the right way and right environment. So I love that. So yeah, you've got to check out General Magic. The other piece, when you talk about these principles and all of these things, is we can find amazing principles, whether that's, Ray Dalio's book, Principles, or it's Covey, 7 Habits. I think the challenge is to make that compelling in a story. And you've mentioned this need and yearning for a story to inspire people, to emotionally connect. And what perhaps Apple and Steve did with creating narrative, creating stories, Pixar do with creating stories, is we yearn for stories. We yearn to be able to, I want to be taken on that challenge, on the hero's journey, whatever it may be around the story. And my last piece in setup to then end with a question for you is I got really intrigued with the work at Singularity University and Peter Diamandis, and I know you're very close to Mountain View, which they moved from the NASA Research Park down to Mountain View, and they do a lot of work around innovation that is using graphic novels and science fiction to create these visions of future that are about stories. And they have these graphic novels of here's the future of education, here's the future of health. Apple's biggest impact's going to be in health, right? That's what they tell us, not everything that's gone before. And maybe the biggest company that we haven't even seen yet is going to be the next education company that transforms the world in a profound way. So my last piece is, whilst each of these principles, and you've given us a sneak peek with one of them, I'd love to know maybe what are some more of these meta principles that exist, and what is maybe the best story that you've experienced that has helped somebody understand how to lead towards their future self that you might be able to share. How did it happen? What was it? Was it a graphic novel? Who was it? How did it come about? So share a couple of the other principles, the meta principles, and then maybe what was a great story and arc around wrapping those principles in a way that really hit people in the head and heart.
Yeah. Oh, I love that question. Yeah. And I agree. I mean, there's no doubt that, like Einstein said it, right? Imagination is more important than knowledge, right? So in the hierarchy of things, as far as leading the future, right? Leaning in, it is a creative future, right? And so Ken Robinson, right? There's a reason, right? That TED Talk is so definitive, and yet he is outright, right, slamming the educational system as it exists, right? Why do how schools kill creativity? You could say, why do they do it, right? And the same could be said about business, right? Why does it kill creativity? And on average, and I think we're seeing that pendulum swing, right? I think there's still a power struggle between companies and people, the market, or companies saying, oh, well, we have the power and now we can lay off or we can do what we want. But I think there's still this unresolved reality of people's passion, right? Which is creative too, that speaks to, as Steve would say, it's like, makes their heart sing, right? And what are those things that do that? And yeah, for our, with the other meta principles that we've explored that, essentially, to use Steve, I keep referencing Steve, but like to use his language, they asked him one time, how do you think about your products? And by the way, one of the things he said once was, they asked him, what's your favorite product you've ever helped to build, right? And he said, it's the culture, right? And if you asked Ed Catmull too, right, about Pixar, and this is clear in the book Creativity Inc. And I think any great leader it's the culture, right? Because it's the gift that keeps on giving. We talk about in science, like it's impossible to create a perpetual energy motion machine, but you can do it when you build the right culture, right? And the best that is future oriented. And yeah, so I mean, if I were to, there's other principles, right, that or meta principles that we've discovered, since then. Just one other quick, this is an aside, but it's worth it. Is that, we asked Ed, we kind of intuited, and we had other conversations with him. He's become an advisor, in conversation, with our work with BraveCore. And, we kind of intuited this, but we thought, well, it must be like, there's no other explanation than that Jon Favreau, right, with The Mandalorian, what he's done, there must be a connection between him and Ed. And so we asked, because you look at this, and we believe that notion of brain trust, right, this co-creative sensibility about a team, that is also the future, right? That sensibility. And when we asked him, he said, yeah, he kind of lit up like a kid in the candy store. And he's like, well, he goes, well, a lot of Disney directors have asked me questions, right, and gotten, advice from me. He said, but John's the one Disney director that came to Pixar and observed the Pixar brain trust, right, as it operated, right, in real time, and was immersed in that. And so when you watch like The Mandalorian, the gallery, that circle of directors, right, Bryce Dallas Howard, Taika Waititi, these directors, Deborah Chow, they're working as a brain trust, right? And you can call it what you will. I think at the core, we've explored this notion with Ed, and he said to us, so we have a white paper. It's on our website, so bravecore.co. It's called Influence by Design, and it's basically this notion that co-creation can apply to any domain, right? And if you do it well, you're starting with leading with question, but there are other elements, let's say, that are important. Turning pain into power is one that, we've experienced a lot of pain in our lives. I could give examples of that. One I could share that's also co-creative, because we believe that it's, it's not an either or, but, a lot of what's out there, right, that we see is, and we have a lot of respect for a lot of these thought leaders and people that share ideas, people like, Adam Grant, Daniel Pink, right? But the challenge that happens sometimes is, there's an idea, and then you kind of get these moats built around it. And it's kind of a siloed system, right? And the beauty of what Covey had done and what Ed did for the sake of Pixar, what I think companies can do for themselves with their principles is create something that can last, right? That can scale into the future. And so if you take that turn pain into power, I'll just share an example of our friend Clint Schaff. He was at the LA Times. This is an organization, right? They're right in the newspaper business. It's like ripe for disruption, right? They were, the print business was basically gone. He got brought in, and he's somebody who is just an innovative thinker, right? He's somebody who just thinks outside of the box. And he had done other work on like launching the Palm brand, and so he's there at LA Times, and he gets into a room and just starts ideating, right, with his team. He's like, what kind of things can we do? Like, what's possible, right? So imagination, we were talking about that earlier. They write up a list of like I think it was 100 things. And he said number 40, it was in the 40s, let's say 47. It said, start a podcast. And, that would seem like a small thing, right? But that one kernel of an idea, they went after, and they created this, what he called it, LA Times Studios. And, they were in, while the rest of the company was in the red, they went in the black, right? For that business, $10 to $15 million, business. It was based on these podcasts. They got, 50, 60 million listeners. They did deals with Netflix, right? To produce these shows. And so there's a creative element to that. But it was also an energy that was co-creative that carried over into the LA Times itself and helped the culture to lean into its future, being more digital, right? And as far as what they could become. We've had them on our podcast. That episode will be released at some point, but I think examples like that. I mean, another one, is Angela Ahrens. She has a great TED Talk. She's a friend, she's advised us or shared some thoughts, over the years. She did a transformation at Burberry. She was CEO with, a company that, how would they move into their future? Well, what they did was they honored the past in a very special way. Right. So there's a video about this. It tells the story. They actually created a physical book that was an artifact, but it told of the chapters of the future too, where they were headed. So it told the history, right? And then they built this future, and then they transformed the store experience like she did at Apple later, these 500 stores. But at Burberry, it was, hey, we're going to converge this digital experience for customers, right, with physical, and give people the experience they want. At Apple, she took this notion and which was, we serve, don't sell, right? So you go into an Apple store and you don't feel like they're looking at you like you're a credit card, right? Or you're a fistful of cash. They're looking at you like, right, that Disney experience where it's like, hey, I want to give you an experience that's very special, right? And the products do that too. Yeah.
I think what's very interesting and the challenge is to take things that are very complex into something that, yes, you mentioned about having longevity, but also being able to be understood at all levels. So things like serve, don't sell is so simple in its profound principle. I can do that wherever I am in the organization. I can live that. I can understand it. It's not something that's so complex to think about, well, how do I do that? How do I behave in that way in my world? And I don't know if you've come across the My Intent little donut.
Oh, no.
Have you ever come across these? So I was at a conference in 2018, A360 conference, and they had the founder there, very super quick because I'm conscious of time. He was talking about our obsession with time. And we have our watch, and what time is it? I've got my podcast with Chris at 6. What time is it? And we're always thinking about what the time is, not necessarily what are we doing with that time? What is our reminder of that? And so he created these little My Intent pieces that you would put one word. So what time is it? What's my intent? What am I doing?
I love that.
And I thought it was just beautiful. And it's now become a whole cult following of all of these things. And you see lots of people with them. It's a bit like the Oura rings, you see photos of people and you go, an Oura ring. So mine is, I've got two actually. The first one I had was Unite Humanity. That's part of my MTP, my massive transformational purpose. One of my values and a value inside the organization is co-elevate. So it's not just about collaboration or those sorts of things, it's co-elevation. So when we're doing it, how can all of the boats rise in the tide? And a couple of our other principles, like, how are we being a hero, pioneering, those sorts of things. I also want to mention two bits. In my book that's coming out in the next few weeks, in part 7, I've got knowledge is no longer power, something you mentioned earlier, and a whole piece about the imagination economy, under the piece of the paradox of learning and unlearning. So I love it. So many interesting things that are coming up, Chris, and I think we could just geek out on lots of things, because this is a happy space, right? It's about thinking and envisaging a future. How do people then put together a way in which they can go and enjoy the experience of discovering a expansion of it? So not a pursuit of, it already exists. We're just expanding that. It's not this, thing over there that's mysterious. No, we're already part of that. We just want to, it's a bit like the difference of a sculptor reveals what's already inside it. So I'm going to shift us to the last question, if I may, because you've shared so many amazing, interesting things. And I'd love to know your view when you watch General Magic, what you think of it.
I will,
it's about curiosity, and it's linked to innovation, and it's linked to this thought of not just thinking differently in the sense of how do we look at a mirror, how do we look at ourselves? It's the sense of firsts. So we might think when we're young, everything's a first. So we're going out, we're experiencing firsts. And as we get later and we go, been there, done it, got the t-shirt, is one of these cultural pieces that we talk about of, hey, I'm experienced, I've done it, I've got the scars, I've got the battle wounds. So we think of going to those people for answers, not necessarily the experimentation. I don't have the t-shirt yet, I'm doing it new. Even if it's the same thing, I'm doing it with that naive mind, I'm doing it as a first. So in that context and that thought of whether it's something you've done many times or it truly was new, when was the last time you did something for the first time, and what was it?
Wow, that's a great question. Well, I alluded to the metaphor of the rafting earlier, and I actually had that experience rafting with my son. We were on a trip this summer, and it was a group of people too. So, there's some people that knew what they were doing, fortunately. I was out there just, ready to, just, lean in. And funny enough, I think the 6 other people in the raft, or 5 other, there was one expert, of course, right? He's the guide. I think there was 1 or 2 others that kind of knew what they were doing generally, or one that had been before. But we were kind of the less experienced of the bunch. And so, we're going, and I just thought, well, my goal is to not get thrown out, right, of the raft. And I just love the metaphor. Like I was talking to this friend of mine who, he worked on iPhones and other things at Apple, and then he's at Meta, Facebook now. He works on MetaQuest, and he was using the same analogy, right? Because there's a sense of being agile, right, when you're in a raft and you're a team. So we're starting out, and one of the guys flies out of the front, and like we helped him back in, and I thought, well, that's not going to be me, right? So no matter what happens, I'm going to hold tight and hold fast to this, so I'm not out. And we go over this. I think it's a level 4. They technically can't do higher, so it's one of these that's tough. And our guide's like, "You're gonna be fine. Just lean in when I say." I think we did most everything right, but it wasn't ending well. So the raft starts going. I feel it. I'm holding on though. I'm like, I'm not letting go, but I can literally feel the raft rising above me, and I realized. And I see the other guys, they're gone, right? And I thought, oh, well, yeah, I'm going to keep holding on, but it's going down. And, I flipped out. We went through a tunnel, and, we ended up getting back in. And actually, it was one of those experiences where we were better prepared, as a team after that experience, and we weren't afraid, right? We thought, well, we got thrown out before, and,
a Dr. Pepper moment.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And, just to talk or just to touch back on what you were saying earlier about, this notion of, we were talking about imagination and co-creation and all these elements of things. And, sometimes it's messy, sometimes it's hard, right? Sometimes it's the unexpected hits us and we're like, and it's not fun, right? But I think there are moments where we get, and like we did in that raft after, I mean, there were moments where you're just sitting in nature and it's just incredible, right? And I think what we've underestimated in the past, because it has been such a solo focus, right? People have built silos, thought leaders have built ivory towers, right? And people have focused as entrepreneurs on building an empire. And that has secluded people from this. And granted, you can get in the zone in any art, right? And that's a special moment, right? When you're in the zone, you're painting, you're creating, you're making music, whatever it is that you love. But what better way to experience work and work life than to be in the zone with others, right? That shared flow.
Yeah.
And that's been my experience in some of these companies, in those moments with the brain trust or co-creation, is getting in that shared flow. And I think what you're describing with that timeless nature of those principles, right? The mind counter, that's powerful, right? It's like, well, yeah, you're getting out of that obsession with the day-to-day. This is something I love about, sometimes I'll go to Europe and I'm like, these people are on the clock, right? You're sitting in a restaurant, you're like,
yeah,
is anybody going to come? And you're like, wait a minute, but this is kind of nice. I got this space. I get to just kind of think, but I'll tell you too, like sitting with Ed, we planned it as a 30-minute meeting. It turned into 3 hours, right? And you get in that zone. It's not always about time, but I mean, the reality is it becomes timeless. It literally becomes timeless, right? And that's something special, I think, that we've been overlooking, but that we need to explore further in the future.
I love a couple of the pieces there. This shift, I think, where we've built our systems around mitigating risk. And how can I prevent something from happening? I don't want to fall out the raft, so I'm holding on tight. I don't want to fail at this, so I'll hold on tight. Whatever your hold on tight is, because we don't want something, our governance, compliance, risk culture has been one that has had that at the core, and it would be the edges. Hey, I've done something that's not what our culture is. And how often is that where the surprise, the delight, the experience, the smiles come from? When you looked at the brain trust in the cameras, it was about sharing, not closed. When we look at the areas of where we're holding on so tight, we can't move, to actually experience greatness, whether it's good or bad, is just how we view it. But if we can't experience because we're holding on so tight, we can't be in flow. It's like my blooming game of golf before I broke my elbow. You know, when you hold on too tight, you can't hit it right. When you just relax, when we shift and actually go to this moment of play, go this moment of, you know, risk taking, is actually experimentation. It's the joy of those things. And I am so excited about organizations creating environments that are adaptable in a way that they can think about the way in which they've got team support, the way in which they understand their environment, they understand the actual abilities of unlearning, of resilience, of grit, of mental flexibility, all of those kind of things for the magic to happen.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. And just one thought to tie it back nicely, I think, to what you
end up, Chris, if you may, when you tie it in, how do people best get in touch with you if they want to connect? I know you've mentioned the site a couple of times. So your reflection, then end out with how we get.
Okay.
Chris.
Yeah, just to close it out too. I mean, you were talking about expert. I call it at BraveCore. We call it, it's, you know, the expert model, right? It's where, you know, you have this expertise that's and it's not a bad thing, right? It's like, hey, we want somebody who's gone through it. But I'll tell you, in that raft, we had the guy who was the guide, right? He had been through it 1,000 times. I don't know how many times, you know, he's done it for years, right? So he's like, I've seen it all. I know how this is, you know, this angle, that angle, but that was useless to us at some point, right? Like, granted, it was helpful to get positioned, and then other things, you know, in other moments it was helpful. But as far as us being in or out of that raft, it was probably inevitable. We were going to hit it, and we were going to hit it hard, right? And you know, but how do we stay in learning mode as a team? And then what about you know, if we could build a shared expert model or an expert team, right? Then, you know, you can be unstoppable. I mean, look at the Golden State Warriors. Like, what have they done, you know, that other teams haven't done or haven't seen? And there, you know, a lot of these teams that are built around this rock star player, right? That are grabbing for the, you know, the attention and grabbing for the front office, right? And it gets annoying, right? Because, you know, they're on a microphone interview. Hey, are you guys going to win? Well, yeah, because I'm the best in the world. We're like, oh, everybody's, you know, really? They talk to the Warriors, and, you know, Steph Curry says, well, are you guys going to win? Well, we'll see. I mean, we have a great team. You know, he talks about the team, right? And
like Moneyball, you know, a movie about the story of thinking differently than, you know, the single star to the actual play the team. Yeah.
So there's that whole selfless element. And I would just say that's part of the beginnings of this, you know, kind of co-creative life or leadership that it will lead the future. And, you know, people can decide how they want to do that. I think leaders are coming to a realization. I mean, a lot of the old school methods are just emperor's new clothes now. Everybody can see through it. It's becoming more obvious. And a lot of people are retiring and moving on because they realize, you know, those control methods don't work. Those things don't work.
Bob's out. He's seen Chris come along, and Bob's saying, my time is done.
Yeah. Well, and it's great to be here, Ross. I you know, thank you for the opportunity. And for those that want to connect, bravecore.co is our website. Feel free to connect with me, you know, on LinkedIn. You know, happy to, you know, or check out our podcast, you know, Lead with the Question. And I'm looking forward to staying connected with you, Ross. It's been a great conversation. Yeah, I've enjoyed it.
Loved it, Chris. Thank you for taking the time and being so open in your sharing so many things. I can't wait to re-listen to this one. I do my podcast because I love learning, and it's been a great experience. So thank you.
Thank you.
And until we connect again.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Do you have the level of adaptability to survive and thrive the rapid changes ahead? Has your resilience got more comeback than a yo-yo? Do you have the ability to unlearn in order to reskill, upskill and break through? Find out today and uncover your adaptability profile and score, your AQ. Visit AQai.io to gain your personalized report across 15 scientifically validated dimensions of adaptability. For a limited time, enter code PODCAST65 for a complimentary AQME assessment. AQai, transforming the way people, teams, and organizations navigate change. Thank you for listening to this episode of Decoding AQ. Please make sure you subscribe on your favorite podcast directory, and we'd love to hear your feedback. Please do leave a review and be sure to tune in next time for more insights from our amazing guests.